So we have finished up non-associative learning and we're headed to associative learning. And we're going to start off with classical conditioning. Are you guys ready? Okay, so here's the tree of learning. And we have finished this branch of non-associative learning. We have talked about habituation and sensitization. Now it's on to associative learning, which means that we are pairing two things together. We are making an association of two different things. So this is going to be that this stimulus is associated with this outcome or this other stimulus in my environment. And we're going to start with classical conditioning. So, classical conditioning. This is learning that occurs when an initially neutral stimulus in your environment becomes associated with another stimulus that produces a naturally occurring response, or a reflex, if you will. And this is passive learning. So what that means is you don't have to do anything in order to learn. Your response does not matter. You don't have to make any sort of behavior for classical conditioning to occur. It will just naturally occur. And there's minimal consciousness necessary. So you don't have to think hard about it. It's almost like it automatically happens. It becomes habit too. So, for instance, we associate lightning with the thing that comes after it. So after lightning, we get thunder. And we think of macaroni and cheese, peanut butter and jelly. So these are all associated with each other. So classical conditioning actually has another name for it. It's also known as Pavlovian conditioning, and this is because of the guy who founded it, which is this guy right here. His name is Ivan Pavlov. He was a Russian physiologist. He wasn't even a psychologist. What he was doing when he discovered classical conditioning is he was actually researching the digestive systems of dogs. He was not intending to discover anything about learning. He was trying to measure their salivation levels. He had them in a contraption where he was measuring how much a dog salivated while they were eating. And so what he found is while they were tasting food, the dogs would salivate. That's not surprising. That's what's supposed to happen. But then when they were seeing food, they would salivate. I mean, that makes sense, like seeing the food, you should salivate, it prepares you to eat it. But then seeing the food dish by itself would also cause salivation. And then seeing the person delivering the food, that would cause salivation. Even if they weren't actually delivering the food, if they were just associated with having delivered food at some point, the dog would salivate when they were around. And then the dogs would even salivate if they heard footsteps. If they heard somebody coming, they were like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be fed. So he was like, are they associating with these things, like the food dish, the person that delivers the food, and footsteps coming towards them? Are they associating all of these things with the food? Are they thinking that, oh, this is happening, this means I'm about to be fed? Which is the basis for classical conditioning. They are pairing these things with the food. So, the neutral stimulus is a stimulus that does not produce a specific response. So this could be the footsteps, for example. This is what you start out with. This is just your average Joe thing. Footsteps typically don't elicit a response. A food dish wouldn't typically elicit a response if you've never been fed from it. But then a neutral stimulus can become a conditioned stimulus when it elicits a response after learning occurs. And this learning occurs when a conditioned stimulus has been paired with an unconditioned stimulus. And this unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that naturally and automatically triggers a response. So this unconditioned stimulus, in Pavlov's case, was that food. So the dogs naturally salivated to it, which is their unconditioned response. They didn't have to learn that response. They just naturally did it. It was a reflex for them. So it's also similar with that startle response. So if you paired a light with, so going back to that habituation video with the rat that had the startle response to the loud noise. If you paired a light with that loud noise, the rat might startle to the light by itself, but and that would become a conditioned response, a learned response to a previously neutral stimulus, which is the response to the conditioned stimulus, because it has been paired with the unconditional stimulus. So the light has to be paired with the loud noise, and the loud noise will make the rat jump initially, and then the rat will think, okay, well, that light means that that loud noise is coming, so that's going to make me jump too. And so that is going to elicit a conditioned response as well. So in Pavlov's dogs, the dog food is the unconditioned stimulus. It is a powerful stimulus causing a reflexive reaction. So this is an unconditioned stimulus is really easy when it is biologically relevant. So food is a really good unconditioned stimulus. So is anything that elicits any sort of fear or emotion, anything that causes an automatic response in us, anything to increase the heart rate or make us sweat or anything like that. And then the bell, Pavlov started ringing a bell whenever he caught on to this. He was like, okay, so something's here. I'm going to pair the food with a bell. So what he did is he would ring a bell right before he fed the dogs. So he would pair this bell with his dog food. And as you would guess, they would reflexively salivate to the dog food. That is unconditioned. They did not have to learn to salivate to food. You normally salivate when you eat. But after he paired that bell with the dog food, they also learned to salivate to the bell, which is interesting. Even if the dog food doesn't come after the bell, after they've learned this association, they will still salivate to the bell. But what's important with this whole conditioning process is a thing called contingency. So the US has to occur really soon after the CS in order for this to happen. There is one exception to this that we're going to get to at near the end of this, but they need to be paired together very close in time so the CS can accurately predict that the US is going to happen very soon after. 30 seconds is about the perfect distance from them. So here is an example of Pavlov's dogs. So before conditioning, they were given food and the doggy salivated. This is an unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Then after conditioning, or before conditioning as well, they had the bell and the dog didn't salivate. They didn't have any sort of response to the bell. So this is a neutral stimulus. And this is not a conditioned response. This is no response. And then during conditioning, they paired the bell in the food. First they rang the bell, and then they gave the dog the food. And this would make the dog salivate. So this is the unconditioned response because it's caused by the food. And then after conditioning, they would just test the bell alone. They wouldn't have the food with it. So this is now the conditioned stimulus because it has been conditioned now. And the dog is now salivating to it because it's been paired with food. The dog thinks food is coming. And so now it has that conditioned response of salivation. Alright, so any of you Office fans out there might recognize this scene. The Office has actually a pretty good depiction of Pavlovian conditioning, and I want you guys to watch closely and try and figure out what exactly is going on here. What is the CS, the US, CR, and UR? Alright, can you figure it out? I'll give you a hint. So it doesn't involve him putting out his hand. That is part of a conditioning thing, but that is too complicated to get into right now. So just ignore him putting out his hand. I'm going to give you a second to think of it. You can pause the video if you need to. Alright, so it does involve Altoids, the restart sound of the computer, and the salivation of Dwight. So what's happening here is before conditioning, the Altoids cause Dwight to salivate when he's given one. And then he also hears the restart button, but there's no conditioned response to that. So these two things this is what happens before Jim is conditioning him. This is the natural occurrence of things. But then Jim decides to condition him. So what's happening during conditioning is he pairs the Altoids with the restart sound of his computer, and then the Altoids make him salivate. And then after Jim has conditioned him, he does the restart sound by itself without giving Dwight an Altoid. And Dwight salivates. He says, "My mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden." That is because he started to salivate. Altoids usually make your breath taste good. And then when you salivate, you become very aware of what your mouth tastes like. So with the Altoids, it tastes good, and without the Altoids, it tastes bad with the salivation. Interesting stuff. So, what's really cool is you can even condition human emotions. And we've seen this especially with fear. This is pretty much how we think phobias have come about. So this guy, named John B. Watson, is a really big name for figuring this out. He is the one that brought classical conditioning to America, basically. And he showed that classical conditioning can work on people and that it works on emotions, especially fear. And he did this with a famous study called Little Albert. So in Little Albert, he has this baby, and he shows him all of these different animals, different stimuli, and little Albert's not afraid of any of it. And then he pairs a really loud sound with a white rat, and little Albert learns to become afraid of the rat. And I'm going to show you the video of it. I apologize for the music in this video. It's really obnoxious.
This is the footage of a controversial 1920s experiment on a baby known as Little Albert, conducted by psychologist John B. Watson. The purpose of the experiment was to show that a normal 9-month-old infant could be conditioned to have a phobia of something he wasn't scared of before. Firstly, Watson presented Little Albert with objects the baby wasn't afraid of, objects that Albert initially liked. A monkey, a dog, a rabbit, and finally a white rat. Albert particularly liked the white rat. In all of these clips, notice Albert's positive reaction. Now in these clips is where the conditioning starts. Each time Albert tried to touch the white rat, a loud iron rod was struck that would upset him. Notice how Albert starts to cry when he tries to touch the rat. Albert was then shown a rabbit, but this time he immediately begins to cry and attempts to fall away from it. He then has a negative reaction when a dog is brought.
That poor dog. Oh my gosh.
And then little Albert is agitated when a seal fur coat is brought in. And then Watson wears a furry Santa Claus mask, which invokes an extremely negative response.
So, that's not the most ethical study in the world, and there's some factors in it that are pretty iffy. Like, I'm pretty sure anybody would be scared of that Santa Claus mask, and he was very all up in little Albert's face. I would cry too if he was all up in my face with that mask. But it did show that you can teach, you can pair that fear from that loud sound with that rat and teach little Albert to be afraid of a rat. And what's interesting is that it generalized to other animals too. It wasn't just the rat that he was afraid of now. He was afraid of the bunny and the dog as well. So, before conditioning, it was a loud noise made him cry. So, the loud noise is what made him cry and made him scared. And then the white rat, he was fine. No big deal. But then during conditioning, they paired the noise with the rat. And so, then after conditioning, they gave him the rat without the noise to see what he would do to the conditioned stimulus, because now the rat had been conditioned to cause a response, and little Albert cried. So I told you that I would talk about the one that breaks the rule of contingencies, and that's called conditioned taste aversions. So, have you ever gotten sick afterwards, after eating a certain food, and then that totally ruined that food for you? So after you got sick, you can't even think of that food, see it, smell it, or it'll make you sick to your stomach. If you do, you have a conditioned taste aversion. And my conditioned taste aversion is unfortunately chili dogs, which is weird because I can eat chili on its own and I can eat a hot dog on its own, but if they're paired together, I can't do it. So what this is you have paired that sickness with the food. So you're like, I have eaten this new food and then I got sick a couple hours later. It must have been the new food that caused the sickness. And this breaks the rule of contingency because it can be hours after you eat that food when you get sick and you can still make that association. And they think the reason why this works is because it's such a biological relevant thing for survival, you know? So when we were hunters and gatherers back in the day, if we ate a berry that we found and it made us terribly, terribly sick, then we knew that maybe we shouldn't eat that berry anymore. Maybe that's a poisonous berry. So that would prevent us from dying in the future. So what have you been conditioned to? We've all been conditioned to things. Let's just think about this situation. So you're driving down the road and you suddenly hear a siren and see blue flashing lights behind you. How does this make you feel? It probably makes you feel a little panicked. My heart sinks down into my stomach when this happens. I'm like, oh my gosh. I freak out a little bit. But what happens when you see one far in front of you? I often am like, better slow down. It's fine. It's a kind of a sign of relief, really, because someone else is pulled over. That means that the cop's already busy. Or it means that there's an accident and there's a bunch of traffic. So think about the things that you've been conditioned to. There's so many out there.